The goblet shattered against the marble floor before Elena even understood why she was being pulled through the palace doors. Two guards held her arms so tightly that her feet barely touched the ground. The great hall stretched before her, filled with hundreds of eyes, all turning toward the commotion. Torches lined the stone walls, casting long shadows across the gathered nobles, and at the far end of the hall, seated on a throne carved from black wood, was King Draven. He did not rise. He did not even look surprised. He simply watched, as the guards dragged her forward and forced her to her knees before him. "This is the girl," said Lady Seraphine, stepping out from beside the throne. Her voice carried across the hall with practiced elegance, though her eyes held something sharper, something cruel. "I found her near the king's private chambers last night." She was trying to enter his room. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elena lifted her head, her chest tightening with confusion and fear. She had never gone near the king's chambers. She worked in the kitchens, 3 floors below, and had not left that wing in over a week. "That is not true," Elena said, her voice steady, despite the guard's grip on her arms. "I was in the kitchen last night. Ask anyone." Seraphine's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. Of course she would deny it. A servant girl, caught trying to climb into the king's bed, would say anything to save herself. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Elena felt heat rise in her face, not from shame, but from anger. She had done nothing wrong, and yet the entire court was ready to believe a lie simply because a noblewoman had spoken it. King Draven finally leaned forward, resting his elbow on the arm of his throne. His eyes, pale and cold as winter ice, studied Elena the way a man might study an insect that had wandered too close to his boot. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice low and even. It was not really a question. It was a formality, the kind a king performed before delivering a judgment he had already made. "No, my king," Elena said. "I have never gone near your chambers. I do not know why Lady Seraphine would say such a thing." Draven studied her for a long moment. Something flickered behind his eyes, something Elena could not name, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "It does not matter whether it is true," he said finally, loud enough for the whole hall to hear. "A servant girl chasing after a king is beneath discussion. She is nothing, a kitchen maid with delusions above her station." Laughter rippled through the court. Elena's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Seraphine stepped closer to the throne, resting a hand delicately on its arm, as if she already owned it. "Perhaps she believed that if she gave you a child, you would be forced to acknowledge her. Servant girls have tried such tricks before." More laughter. Elena's face burned, but she kept her eyes forward, refusing to look away from the king who sat in judgment over her. Draven rose from his throne then, slow and deliberate, and walked down the few steps until he stood directly in front of her. Up close, he was even more imposing than she had imagined from the kitchens below, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in black and silver, a crown resting on his dark hair like it had been made for no one else. He crouched slightly, so that his eyes were level with hers, and the entire hall fell silent to hear what their king would say. "Let me make something clear," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "so that no other servant girl gets foolish ideas. You will never carry my heir. Not you, not anyone like you. My bloodline is sacred, chosen by the moon itself, and it will never mix with someone as common as kitchen scraps." The court erupted into laughter, cruel and delighted, nobles covering their mouths with jeweled hands, whispering to one another behind painted fans. Seraphine's smile widened, triumphant. Elena did not cry. She refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, she held Draven's gaze, and for one brief moment, something passed between them. Something like a warning neither of them understood yet. "I never asked to carry your heir," Elena said quietly, but clearly enough that those nearest could hear. "I only asked for the truth to be spoken. If you cannot see through her lies, then perhaps you are not the king everyone believes you to be." The hall gasped. No one spoke to the king that way. Guards moved forward, ready to seize her for her insolence, but Draven raised a hand, stopping them. He looked at Elena with something between fury and disbelief, as if a mouse had suddenly bared its teeth at a wolf. "You dare." He never finished the sentence. The torches along the walls flickered violently, all at once, as though a great wind had swept through the hall, though the doors and windows remained shut. The nobles gasped and turned toward the tall windows lining the eastern wall. Outside, the sky, which had been a clear and ordinary night moments before, had begun to change. The moon, full and silver only an hour earlier, was turning red. Not the soft orange of an eclipse, but a deep, pulsing crimson, like a heartbeat made of light. The color spread across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of blood and fire. Every wolf in the hall felt it before they understood it, a pull deep in their chests, an ancient instinct stirring awake after generations of silence. "The blood moon," someone whispered, and the word spread through the hall like a spark catching dry grass. Elena had heard stories of the blood moon as a child, tales her grandmother used to tell by candlelight. It was said to rise only once every 100 years, and when it did, it would choose the true mate of the reigning Alpha King, binding them together with a power older than the crown itself. No one alive had witnessed it. Most believed it was only a legend, a bedtime story, meant to comfort young wolves who dreamed of love, finding them, despite their birth or their station. Draven straightened, turning toward the windows, his expression shifting from anger to something closer to alarm. Around the hall, nobles rose from their seats, pressing toward the glass to see the impossible sky. Seraphine's confident smile faltered for the first time that night. She stepped closer to Draven, placing a hand on his arm. "My king, the moon recognizes you. It has come to confirm what we all already know." But the moon's crimson light did not settle over Seraphine. It did not settle over any of the nobles crowding the windows, eager to claim the ancient blessing for themselves. It settled over Elena. A soft golden light bloomed beneath her skin, tracing delicate patterns along her wrists and collarbone, patterns that had never been there before. She gasped, staring down at her own arms in shock, as the markings glowed brighter, pulsing in rhythm with something deep inside her chest, something that felt like a second heartbeat that did not belong to her. The hall fell into stunned silence. Draven turned slowly, his eyes moving from the crimson moon outside the window to the glowing marks spreading across Elena's skin. His face, usually composed and unreadable, cracked with disbelief. "That is not possible," he said, more to himself than to anyone else in the hall. The guards who had been holding Elena's arms released her without being ordered to, stepping back as though she had suddenly become something dangerous, something they no longer understood how to touch. Elena rose slowly to her feet, staring down at the markings glowing along her arms, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that she had no words for. "The blood moon has chosen," an old voice called out from near the back of the hall. It was Elder Corwin, the palace's oldest advisor, a man who had served 3 kings before Draven, and who alone among the nobles seemed to understand the full weight of what was happening. He pushed his way through the crowd, his weathered face pale with shock. "It has chosen the king's true mate." "No," Draven said, his voice sharp, final. "This is a trick, some kind of curse, or a mistake." "The moon does not make mistakes, my king," Elder Corwin said quietly, though there was something careful in the way he spoke, as though he feared the answer as much as everyone else in the room. "It has not risen in 100 years. It would not rise now for anything less than the truth." Seraphine's hand fell away from Draven's arm. Her face, moments ago glowing with triumph, had turned pale and tight with fury. She looked at Elena the way one might look at a stain that refused to wash out of expensive silk. "There must be some mistake," Seraphine said, her voice losing its earlier smoothness. "She is nothing, a servant. This cannot be real." But the glowing marks on Elena's skin did not fade. If anything, they grew brighter, curling delicately along her collarbone in patterns that resembled moonlight caught in water. She could feel something stirring within her, something ancient and unfamiliar, as though a door long sealed had suddenly creaked open inside her chest. Draven stared at her, his jaw tight, his hands curled into fists at his sides. Whatever he was feeling, it was clear he did not welcome it. His pale eyes moved over the markings on her skin with something close to horror, as though the moon itself had betrayed him. "Take her to the West Tower," he said finally, his voice cold and clipped. "Under guard. No one speaks of this outside this hall until I decide what is to be done." My king, Elena started, but he was already turning away, climbing back up the steps to his throne, refusing to look at her again. Two new guards stepped forward, more gentle than the first, though their confusion was clear on their faces. They did not know how to treat a servant girl who had, in the span of a single moment, become something the entire kingdom had waited 100 years to see. As they led her from the hall, Elena glanced back once. Draven sat rigid on his throne, staring at nothing, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Around him, the court whispered and murmured, already reshaping the story of what had happened into 100 different versions. Seraphine remained standing near the throne, her expression unreadable, though her eyes followed Elena out of the hall with a coldness that made the hair on the back of Elena's neck rise. Outside the tall windows, the crimson moon continued to burn against the night sky, indifferent to the chaos it had caused below. The west tower was cold and mostly unused, a relic from an older wing of the palace that had fallen out of favor generations ago. The guards led Elena up a narrow spiral staircase, their footsteps echoing against stone walls that had not seen fresh paint in decades. At the top, they opened a heavy wooden door and gestured for her to enter. The room inside was simple, but far grander than anything Elena had ever slept in. A large bed stood against one wall, draped in soft blue linens. A fireplace crackled in the corner, already lit, as though someone had known she would be brought here before she herself had known it. Tall windows looked out over the palace grounds, and through them, Elena could still see the faint red glow of the moon beginning to fade back toward its normal silver light. The door closed behind her with a heavy, final sound, and she heard the guards take their positions outside. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, staring down at her hands. The glowing markings had faded now, leaving only faint traces along her skin, like the ghost of moonlight after the sun had risen. She pressed her palm against her chest, where she could still feel that strange second heartbeat, steady and warm, beating in time with something far away. She thought of Draven's face when the moon had chosen her. Not joy, not even curiosity. Only horror, as if the universe had played a cruel joke on him by binding him to someone he had just called kitchen scraps in front of his entire court. A soft knock came at the door, hesitant, unlike the guard's usual firm announcements. Elena rose and opened it to find a young woman standing there, dressed in the pale robes of a palace healer, carrying a tray with bread, cheese, and a cup of warm tea. "I thought you might be hungry," the woman said quietly. "My name is Ren. I work in the healing wing." Elena stepped aside to let her in, grateful for a friendly face after the chaos of the hall. Ren set the tray down on a small table near the fireplace and glanced at Elena with open curiosity, though there was kindness in her eyes rather than judgment. "Is it true?" Ren asked softly. "What they are saying downstairs, that the blood moon chose you." Elena sat down slowly, wrapping her arms around herself. "I don't know what happened. One moment the king was mocking me in front of the entire court, and the next, the sky turned red, and these markings appeared on my skin." Ren's eyes widened slightly, and she stepped closer, examining the faint traces still visible along Elena's collarbone. "My grandmother used to speak of the blood moon. She said it only chooses once in 100 years, and only for the truest of bonds. It cannot be forced, and it cannot be faked. If it chose you, then whether the king accepts it or not, you are already bound to him. He does not want this," Elena said quietly. "He made that very clear before the moon even rose." Ren was silent for a moment, pouring the tea and pressing the warm cup into Elena's hands. "Kings do not always get to choose what the moon decides for them. That is the whole meaning of the old legend. The blood moon does not care about crowns or bloodlines or what a king believes he deserves. It only cares about the truth of a bond, even one neither person is ready to accept." Elena wrapped her fingers around the warm cup, letting the heat seep into her cold hands. Outside the window, the last traces of red had faded from the moon, leaving only its familiar silver glow hanging over the palace grounds. "What happens now?" Elena asked. Ren's expression grew careful, almost worried. "I do not know. No one alive has seen this happen before, but I would be careful, if I were you. Not everyone in this palace will be pleased that the moon chose a kitchen maid over a lady of noble birth." Lady Seraphine's family has powerful friends, and pride like hers does not forgive easily. A chill settled over Elena that had nothing to do with the cold stone walls of the tower. She thought of the fury she had seen flash across Seraphine's face in the hall, quickly hidden but not quick enough. She thought of the guards who had looked at her with new uncertainty, unsure whether she was now someone to protect or someone to fear. "Try to rest," Ren said gently, moving toward the door. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you will need your strength." After Ren left, Elena remained by the window for a long while, watching the palace grounds below, the guards patrolling the outer walls, the distant lights of the kitchen wing, where she had spent every night for the past 3 years, believing her life would never be anything more than long hours and quiet corners. She thought of her mother, who had died when Elena was young, and her grandmother, who had raised her on stories of moonlight and old magic before she too had passed, leaving Elena alone, in a palace that had never once looked at her as anything other than a servant. Now the entire kingdom knew her name. She did not know if that was a blessing or a curse. Somewhere below, in the depths of the palace, Draven sat alone in his private study, staring into a fire that had long since burned low. Elder Corwin stood near the door, having followed him from the hall, though he had not yet dared to speak. "Say it," Draven finally said, his voice rough. "Whatever you came here to say." Elder Corwin stepped further into the room, choosing his words carefully. "The bond cannot be broken, my king. Not by refusal, not by distance, not even by time. The old texts are clear on this. The longer you resist it, the more it will weaken you, both in body and in spirit." "I do not care what the old texts say," Draven snapped, rising from his chair and pacing toward the window. Below, the palace grounds stretched out in darkness, and somewhere in the west tower, a light still burned in a single window. "I have spent my entire life preparing to rule this kingdom with a bloodline worthy of the crown. I will not have that legacy tied to a servant girl because of some ancient curse dressed up as a blessing." "It is not a curse," Elder Corwin said quietly. "It is the oldest magic our people know. The moon does not choose based on birth or wealth or title. It chooses based on truth, on the parts of a soul that even the person themselves may not fully understand yet." Draven's jaw tightened, his hands pressed flat against the cold stone windowsill. "Then the moon is wrong." Elder Corwin said nothing to that, though the look on his weathered face suggested he did not believe the moon had ever once been wrong in the history of their people. "Leave me," Draven said finally, his voice quiet now, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. Elder Corwin bowed and left without another word, closing the study door softly behind him. Alone, Draven pressed a hand against his chest, where a strange, unfamiliar warmth had settled since the moment the crimson light had touched Elena's skin. It beat steadily beneath his ribs, foreign and impossible to ignore, no matter how much he wished it away. Outside his window, the moon had returned to its ordinary silver light, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But Draven knew, with a certainty that unsettled him more than he would ever admit, that everything had changed the moment that light had chosen the one person in his kingdom he had sworn, only hours earlier, would never carry his heir. A hand closed over Elena's mouth before her eyes had fully opened. She jerked upright, her heart slamming against her ribs, and found a figure in a dark cloak leaning over her bed, a blade glinting faintly in the low firelight. Instinct took over before thought could. She twisted hard to the side, driving her elbow into the attacker's ribs, and rolled off the bed, just as the blade came down where her chest had been a heartbeat earlier. She hit the floor hard, scrambling backward toward the door, opening her mouth to scream. No sound came out. The attacker had already recovered, moving with the silence of someone well-trained, someone who had done this kind of work before. "Guards!" Elena finally managed, her voice cracking with fear. The door burst open before the attacker could reach her again. One of the palace guards, a broad-shouldered man named Callan, who had been stationed outside her room since the night before, charged in and tackled the cloaked figure against the wall. A brief, violent struggle followed, the attacker fighting with desperate strength, but Callan was larger and had the advantage of surprise. Within moments, he had the attacker pinned to the floor, wrists bound behind their back, with a length of cord pulled from his own belt. More guards flooded into the room, torches raised, faces alarmed. One of them pulled back the attacker's hood, revealing the face of a young man Elena did not recognize, his expression twisted with fury rather than fear at being caught. "Who sent you?" Callan demanded, pressing a knee firmly against the man's back. The attacker said nothing, his jaw clenched shut, his eyes darting toward Elena, with a hatred that made her stomach turn cold. "Take him to the dungeon," Callan ordered the other guards. "The king will want to question him himself." As they dragged the man from the room, Elena remained on the floor, her whole body trembling, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Callan crouched beside her, his earlier sternness softening into concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Elena shook her head, though her hands would not stop shaking. "How did he get past the guards?" Callan's jaw tightened. "That is exactly what I intend to find out." Word of the attack reached Draven within minutes. He arrived at the West Tower still dressed in the clothes he had worn to bed, his dark hair disheveled, his expression thunderous. He found Elena sitting by the fire, wrapped in a blanket Ren had draped over her shoulders, her face pale but composed once more. "Explain," Draven said sharply to Callan, who stood at attention near the door. "An intruder entered through the servant passage on the lower level, my king," Callan reported. "He must have known the palace layout well, to avoid the main guard posts. He was armed and made a direct attempt on her life. I stopped him before he could finish the job." Draven's eyes moved to Elena, taking in the faint bruise forming on her arm where she had struck the floor during her fall. Something dark passed behind his pale eyes, though whether it was concern or simple calculation, Elena could not tell. "Who is he?" Draven asked. "He gave no name, my king. He is being held in the dungeon, awaiting your questioning." Draven nodded once, then turned to Elena, his expression unreadable. "You are unharmed?" "I am fine," Elena said quietly, though her voice still carried a slight tremor. He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind, then turned sharply and left the room without another word, Callan following close behind him. Elena sat alone by the fire long after they had gone, staring into the flames, trying to steady her racing heart. She had lived her entire life as a nobody in this palace, invisible to everyone but the other kitchen staff. Now, in the span of a single day, she had become important enough that someone wanted her dead before the sun even rose again. Deep beneath the palace, in a cell lit only by a single flickering torch, Draven stood before the captured attacker, his arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. "Who sent you?" he said again, his voice low and dangerous. The man on the floor lifted his chin, defiant despite the ropes binding his wrists. "You should be thanking me, my king. That girl does not belong on the throne beside you. Everyone in this palace knows it. I was only doing what half the court wishes they had the courage to do themselves." Draven's expression did not change, though something cold settled behind his eyes. "You will tell me who sent you, or you will remain in this cell until you do." The man laughed, a short, bitter sound. "No one sent me. I acted alone, out of loyalty to this kingdom's bloodline. Punish me if you wish. It will not undo what I tried to do, and it will not stop others who feel the same." Draven studied the man for a long moment, searching his face for the tell of a lie, but found none. Whether the man spoke the full truth or not, it was clear he would give no names, no matter how long he sat in that cell. "Take him to the eastern holding block," Draven finally said to the guard standing nearby. "He is not to be released without my direct order." As Draven climbed the stairs back toward the upper levels of the palace, Elder Corwin was waiting for him near the entrance to the dungeon, his weathered face etched with concern. "This will not be the last attempt," Elder Corwin said quietly. "Word has already spread through the court, and likely beyond the palace walls by now. There are those who will see her as a threat to the old bloodlines, and there are those loyal to Lady Seraphine's family who will not accept this outcome easily." "I am aware," Draven said flatly. "Then you understand she needs proper protection. Guards outside her door are not enough if someone within the palace itself wishes her harm." Draven's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He had spent the entire night trying to convince himself that the bond meant nothing, that it was some cruel trick of fate he could simply ignore until it faded on its own. But the moment he had heard Elena might have been killed while he slept only a few floors away, something in his chest had twisted so violently it had nearly driven him to his knees. He had told himself it was only the bond's magic pulling at him, nothing more. But standing there in the dim corridor, listening to Elder Corwin's warning, he was no longer certain that was the whole truth. "She will be moved to the guest wing near my own chambers," Draven said finally, the words feeling strange and unwelcome even as he spoke them, "where I can ensure her protection myself." Elder Corwin's expression shifted slightly, something like quiet relief crossing his weathered features, though he said nothing about it. "I will have it arranged before midday, my king." By the time the sun rose fully over the palace grounds, word of the attack had indeed spread far beyond the West Tower, exactly as Elder Corwin had predicted. In the kitchens, in the guard barracks, in the sewing rooms where the ladies of the court gathered to gossip over their needlework, everyone was speaking of the servant girl the Blood Moon had chosen, and of the mysterious attacker who had tried to end her life before the sun even rose. In her private chambers, Lady Seraphine sat before her mirror, her maid brushing out her long dark hair in slow, careful strokes. Seraphine's reflection stared back at her, composed on the surface, though her eyes burned with quiet fury. "Is it true, my lady," the maid asked hesitantly, "that someone tried to harm the girl last night?" "I have heard," Seraphine said coolly, watching her own reflection without emotion. The maid continued brushing, sensing the tension in the room, but too well trained to ask further questions. Seraphine's gaze drifted toward the window, toward the West Tower visible in the distance, where Elena had spent the night under heavy guard. A soft knock came at her chamber door, and her personal attendant, a thin, sharp-eyed man named Percival, entered and bowed low. "My lady, your father requests your presence. He has received troubling news." Seraphine rose from her seat, dismissing her maid with a small wave of her hand, and followed Percival through the winding corridors toward her father's study. Lord Halden, head of one of the kingdom's oldest and most powerful families, stood by the window when she entered, his expression grim. "You have heard, then," Seraphine said, closing the door behind her, "that an attempt was made on the girl's life last night." "Yes," Lord Halden said, turning to face his daughter. "And that it failed. Whoever arranged it acted foolishly, without proper planning, and has now only strengthened her position. The king has moved her to the guest wing, near his own chambers for protection. Do you understand what that means?" Seraphine's jaw tightened. "It means he intends to accept the bond after all." "It means," Lord Halden said sharply, "that our years of careful planning to see you seated on that throne are now at risk of collapsing entirely, because someone was reckless enough to act without proper thought. I hope you had no part in that failed attempt last night, daughter. It would be a very foolish thing to have done." "I had no part in it," Seraphine said quickly, though something in her eyes suggested she was not being entirely truthful. "But I do not intend to simply stand by and watch some kitchen maid steal everything I have worked my entire life to earn." Lord Halden studied his daughter for a long moment, then sighed heavily, moving to sit behind his large oak desk. "The Blood Moon's choice cannot be easily undone, Seraphine. Even the king himself cannot simply refuse it without consequence. If we move against her again, it must be done with far greater care than whatever clumsy attempt was made last night. We cannot afford to draw suspicion toward our family." "Then what do you suggest?" Seraphine asked, moving to stand before his desk. Lord Halden was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled thoughtfully before him. "Patience. For now. The bond may be powerful, but bonds can be strained, twisted, even broken under the right pressures. If the girl cannot be removed easily, then perhaps the solution is to ensure the king comes to resent the bond so thoroughly that he seeks to break it himself, through proper and legal means. There are old rituals for such things, rarely used, but they exist." Seraphine considered this, a slow, calculating smile beginning to replace her earlier fury. "And if such pressure fails? Then we will consider other options," Lord Halden said simply, "when the time is right, and not a moment before." Meanwhile, in the guest wing near the king's own chambers, Elena stood by a tall window, looking out over gardens far more beautiful than anything she had seen from the kitchens below. Wren had helped her settle into the new room earlier that morning, though the healer's earlier warmth had been tinged with worry, ever since news of the attack had spread. "You should try to eat something," Ren said gently, gesturing toward a tray of untouched food on the table. "I keep thinking about his face," Elena admitted quietly. "The man who attacked me. He looked at me like I had stolen something from him, though I have never even met him before in my life." "People fear what they do not understand," Ren said, sitting beside her, "and they fear change even more, especially when it threatens the world they believe they know. You did not choose this, Elena, but you will need to be strong regardless, because it seems the world has already chosen for you." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, staring out at the gardens below, where a few early gardeners moved quietly among the rose bushes, utterly unaware of the danger that had crept through the palace halls only hours before. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and Callan entered, bowing respectfully. "The king wishes to speak with you, if you are able." Elena's stomach tightened, though she nodded, and followed Callan through the winding corridors toward Draven's private study. When she entered, she found him standing by the window, much as she had been only moments before, his back turned toward the door. "You wish to see me," Elena said quietly, closing the door behind her. Draven turned slowly, his expression carefully composed, though something uncertain flickered behind his pale eyes. "I have moved you to the guest wing near my chambers. You will be under closer guard from now on." "Thank you," Elena said, though she could not quite read what lay beneath his careful, formal words. "This is not kindness," Draven said quickly, almost defensively. "It is practicality. If harm comes to you, it will bring instability to my kingdom that I cannot afford, given everything the court now believes about the bond."
"Of course," Elena said, though something in her chest ached slightly at his words, a feeling she did not fully understand and did not wish to examine too closely.
Draven studied her for a long moment, his jaw tight, as though there was more he wished to say but could not quite find the words for. Finally, he simply nodded toward the door. "That is all. You may return to your room." Elena left the study without another word, though as she walked back through the winding corridors toward her new chambers, she could not shake the feeling that the king who had looked at her with such careful indifference had, for one brief moment before she left the room, looked as though he wished to say something entirely different. That night, Draven found himself unable to sleep, pacing the length of his own chambers long after the palace had gone quiet. The strange warmth in his chest, that had settled there since the moment the blood moon had chosen Elena, had not faded, no matter how much he tried to ignore it. If anything, since the attack, it had grown stronger. An insistent pull he could not fully explain, urging him toward the guest wing, only a short distance from his own door. He told himself it was simply concern for his kingdom's stability. He told himself it was nothing more than the bond's ancient magic working against his will, but standing alone in the darkness of his chambers, staring toward the wall that separated his room from hers, Draven could no longer fully convince himself that either explanation was the whole truth. The pain hit Draven like a blade between the ribs, sudden and sharp, doubling him over at his own council table in the middle of a meeting with his war advisors. "My king," one of the advisors exclaimed, rushing to his side as Draven gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "I am fine," Draven managed, though his voice was strained, and sweat had broken out along his brow, despite the cool morning air. The pain came again, sharper this time, radiating from somewhere deep in his chest, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, he felt something else. Fear, not his own fear, but someone else's, bleeding through the strange connection he had spent days trying to deny, existed at all. "Get Elder Corwin," Draven ordered, straightening despite the pain still pulsing through him. "Now." By the time Elder Corwin arrived, breathless from hurrying through the palace corridors, Draven had already gathered himself enough to stand, though his face remained pale, his jaw tight with lingering discomfort. "The bond," Draven said, before the old advisor could speak. "Something is wrong." I felt pain, sharp and sudden, and something else beneath it, fear. It was not my own. Elder Corwin's expression grew grave. "The bond connects more than just the body, my king. It connects the spirit as well. If you felt her pain and her fear, then something has happened to her, somewhere in this palace, at this very moment. Draven did not wait to hear more. He was already moving, striding out of the council chamber with Callan and two other guards falling into step behind him, moving swiftly through the palace toward the guest wing where Elena had been staying. They found her in the small garden courtyard attached to the guest wing, where she had gone that morning to walk among the roses, seeking a few moments of quiet before the day's tensions returned. She was on her knees near a stone bench, her hand pressed against a shallow wound along her forearm, blood seeping between her fingers, while a young stable hand lay unconscious a short distance away, a fallen dagger beside him. "Elena," Draven's voice cracked through the courtyard with an urgency that surprised even himself. She looked up at him, her face pale but composed, though her hand trembled slightly where it pressed against the wound. "I am all right. He came at me from behind the hedges. I managed to knock him off balance before he could do worse, but not before he cut me." Callan and the other guards rushed forward, securing the unconscious attacker while Draven knelt beside Elena, examining the wound along her arm with an urgency that made his own hands unsteady, something entirely unfamiliar to a man who had faced battle without flinching more times than he could count. "It is not deep," Elena said, trying to reassure him, though her voice still carried a slight tremor from the shock of the attack. Draven said nothing, tearing a strip of cloth from his own sleeve and wrapping it firmly around her arm, his jaw clenched tight with an anger that had nowhere to go. When he finally looked up at her, something raw and unguarded flickered across his usually composed features, something that looked remarkably like fear. "This is the second attempt on your life in 3 days," he said quietly, his voice rough. "This cannot continue." "I did not ask for any of this," Elena said, meeting his gaze steadily, despite the pain still radiating along her arm. "I did not ask to be chosen. I did not ask for people to want me dead, simply because the moon decided something neither of us understand." "I know," Draven said, and something in the simple honesty of his response surprised them both. Ren arrived moments later, rushing to properly tend Elena's wound, while guards dragged the unconscious attacker away for questioning. Draven remained close by throughout, his usual composed distance entirely abandoned, watching over the process with an intensity that did not go unnoticed by anyone present, including Elena herself. Later that evening, after Elena's wound had been properly cleaned and bandaged, Draven found himself once again standing before the captured attacker in the dungeon below the palace, though this time his patience had worn dangerously thin. "Who sent you?" he demanded, his voice colder and more dangerous than it had been 3 nights earlier. The young man, barely more than a boy, trembled where he knelt on the cold stone floor. Unlike the first attacker, this one had none of the practiced defiance of a trained assassin. He was simply frightened, in over his head, caught up in something far larger than himself. "I was paid," the young man admitted quickly, his voice shaking. "A large sum of gold, more than I could earn in 10 years working the stables. A man approached me 3 nights ago, his face hidden, and told me exactly where to find her and when she would be alone." "What did this man look like?" Draven pressed. "Any detail, a voice, a ring, anything." The young man thought hard, clearly desperate to offer something useful in exchange for leniency. "He wore fine gloves, my king, the kind only nobles can afford, and he spoke with the accent of the Eastern court, the same as many of the noble families who serve within these walls." Draven's jaw tightened. It was not enough to name a specific family, but it narrowed the possibilities considerably, and it confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. This was no random act of prejudice from a servant loyal to old bloodlines. This was calculated, planned, and funded by someone within his own court, who had the resources and the motive to see Elena removed permanently. "Take him to the Eastern holding block, alongside the first attacker," Draven ordered. "He is to be given food and proper treatment." He was clearly nothing more than a desperate tool used by someone far more dangerous. As Draven climbed back toward the upper levels of the palace, Elder Corwin was waiting for him once more, his expression grave. "Eastern accent, fine gloves," Elder Corwin repeated thoughtfully. "That narrows the list considerably, my king. There are perhaps a dozen noble families within the Eastern court who could match that description, though few with both the motive and the resources to arrange something so calculated." "Lord Halden's family," Draven said flatly. "It is possible," Elder Corwin agreed carefully, Though we cannot act on suspicion alone, not against a family as powerful and well-connected as Lord Halden's, we will need clear proof before any accusation can be made, or we risk turning half the court against you at a moment when unity matters most. Draven's hands curled into fists at his sides, frustration boiling beneath his usually controlled exterior. Then we will find that proof. That night, unable to settle his racing thoughts, Draven found himself walking the quiet corridors of the guest wing, drawn by an instinct he no longer bothered denying. He found Elena awake as well, sitting by her window, wrapped in a warm shawl, staring out at the moon that had returned to its ordinary silver glow days earlier. "You should be resting," Draven said quietly from the doorway, though he made no move to leave. "I keep thinking about how close he came," Elena admitted softly, not turning from the window. "If I had not heard him behind me, if I had been a moment slower." "You were not slower," Draven said, stepping further into the room. "You are still here." Elena finally turned to look at him, her expression tired but steady. "Why does this matter so much to you? Days ago you stood before your entire court and called me kitchen scraps. Now you rush across the palace at the first sign that something might have happened to me." Draven was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as though wrestling with words he was not accustomed to speaking aloud. "I felt it," he finally admitted. "When you were attacked in the garden, I felt your pain, your fear, as though it were my own. I did not understand the bond until that moment. I do not think I wanted to understand it, because understanding it means accepting something I am not certain I am ready to accept." Elena studied him carefully, searching his pale eyes for the mockery she had grown to expect from him during their earlier encounters, but found none. Only something raw and uncertain, an honesty he seemed almost embarrassed to be showing her. "I do not need you to accept anything," Elena said quietly. "I only need you to stop looking at me like I am a burden you were forced to carry against your will." "That is not how I see you," Draven said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. "Then how do you see me?" Elena asked, and for a moment, the question hung heavy in the quiet room between them. Draven opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, clearly unsure of how to put into words something he himself did not fully understand. Finally, he simply said, "I do not know yet, but I intend to find out who is trying to harm you, and I intend to stop them, regardless of what I decide about the bond itself." It was not the answer Elena had hoped for, but it was, she realized, an honest one, and after days of cruelty and confusion, honesty felt like something she could hold on to. The following morning, Elder Corwin brought troubling news to Draven's private study. A servant loyal to the crown had overheard a conversation late the previous night between Lord Halden and one of his personal attendants, discussing a shipment of gold that had recently left the family's estate under mysterious circumstances, along with mention of an alliance being quietly formed with representatives from the neighboring kingdom of Vestmore, a kingdom that had long harbored resentment toward Draven's rule. "An alliance with Vestmore," Draven said sharply, rising from his desk. "That would be treason of the highest order." The servant could not confirm the full details, Elder Corwin cautioned, only fragments of the conversation. But combined with the attacks on Elena's life, and Lord Halden's clear motive to see his daughter seated on the throne instead, it paints a troubling picture, my king. Draven paced the length of his study, his mind racing through the implications. If Lord Halden was indeed forming a secret alliance with Vestmore, then the attacks on Elena's life were only the beginning of a far larger plot, one that threatened not just the bond the moon had chosen, but the stability of his entire kingdom. "We need proof," Draven said finally, "concrete enough to bring before the full council, without risking accusations of overreach against one of the most powerful families in the kingdom. I will have our most trusted people look into it quietly," Elder Corwin promised. "But my king, I must caution you. If Lord Halden truly is forming ties with Vestmore, then time may not be on our side. We should move carefully, but we should not move slowly." Draven nodded grimly, staring out the window toward the distant eastern estates, where Lord Halden's family had held power for generations. Whatever was coming, he understood now with growing certainty that it would take far more than simply accepting or denying a bond to protect Elena, and to protect his kingdom from the storm quietly gathering just beyond the palace walls. As the day wore on, Word spread through the palace that the two captured attackers had both confirmed being hired through intermediaries connected to the Eastern Court, without directly naming Lord Haldan's family, careful enough in their arrangements to avoid leaving a clear trail back to their true employer. It was enough to raise serious suspicion, but not enough to act decisively, and Draven found himself trapped in the frustrating position of knowing exactly where the danger was coming from, while lacking the proof needed to stop it directly. That evening, as the palace settled into its nightly quiet, Elena stood once more at her window, watching the guards patrol the grounds below with a wariness that had not existed in her before the blood moon had changed everything. She thought of Draven's words from the night before, the rare honesty in his voice when he admitted he did not yet know how he saw her, only that he intended to protect her regardless. It was not love. It was not even the beginning of trust, not fully, but it was something, a small crack in the cold distance that had defined every interaction between them since the moment the court had first laughed at her humiliation. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, in the shadowed halls of his family estate, Lord Haldan sat with a small group of trusted allies, poring over maps and letters bearing the seal of Vestmore's ruling family, quietly building toward something far larger than two failed attempts on a servant girl's life. Whatever came next, it was clear the true danger to Elena, and to the kingdom itself, had only just begun to take shape. Elena's hands moved with practiced ease as she folded fresh linens in the guest wing's small sitting room, a task Ren had offered simply to give her something to occupy her restless mind. It had been 5 days since the attack in the garden, and though no further attempts had been made against her, the tension within the palace walls had only grown heavier, like the air before a storm that refused to break. A soft knock came at the door, and Callan entered, his expression unusually careful. "The king requests your presence in the training yard, if you are willing." Elena set down the linens, curious despite the strange request. "The training yard?" He did not explain further, Callan said, though something like the beginning of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Only that it was important. Elena followed Callan through the winding corridors and out into the crisp afternoon air, where the palace's training yard stretched before her, usually reserved for the king's guards to practice their combat skills. Draven stood near the center of the yard, dressed simply, without his usual formal attire, a wooden practice sword resting in his hand. "You wish to see me?" Elena asked, approaching cautiously. "After what happened in the garden," Draven said, "I have decided you should learn to properly defend yourself, rather than relying solely on luck and quick instincts." Elena blinked in surprise. "You want to teach me to fight?" "I want you to survive," Draven corrected, though something almost gentle softened the edges of his usual sharp tone. "The attacks against you will not stop simply because guards are watching more closely. If you can defend yourself, even a little, it may be the difference between life and death the next time someone slips past our watch." He held out a second practice sword, considerably lighter than his own, and after a moment's hesitation, Elena took it, testing its weight in her hand. "I have never held a sword in my life," she admitted. "Then we will start simply," Draven said, stepping back to give her room. "Watch my feet, not my blade. Most people make the mistake of watching the weapon, when the true tell of an opponent's next move lies in how they shift their weight." For the next hour, Draven guided her through basic movements, correcting her stance, showing her how to block a strike without overextending herself, how to use an opponent's own momentum against them. Elena was clumsy at first, stumbling more than once, but she was quick to learn, absorbing his corrections with a focus that clearly impressed him, even if he did not say so directly. "You are better than you give yourself credit for," Draven said, after she successfully blocked 3 consecutive strikes, something like genuine surprise coloring his voice. "I have spent 3 years carrying heavy pots and kneading dough before sunrise," Elena said, slightly breathless from the exertion. "Perhaps that counts for something." A short, unexpected laugh escaped Draven, quickly caught and suppressed, though not before Elena noticed it, her own lips curving into a small smile at having drawn such a rare reaction from him. As the session continued, something shifted subtly between them, the careful distance that had defined their earlier interactions softening into something closer to easy familiarity. When Elena stumbled and nearly lost her footing entirely, Draven caught her arm without thinking, steadying her, before either of them fully registered how close the movement had brought them together. For a long moment, neither moved. Draven's hand remained on her arm, and Elena's breath caught slightly at the sudden nearness, at the warmth radiating from him despite the cool afternoon air. His pale eyes, usually so guarded, held something unguarded now, something searching, as though he too were only just beginning to understand what he felt. "Thank you," Elena said softly, breaking the moment before it could stretch too long, "for teaching me this." Draven released her arm, stepping back, though something in his expression suggested the moment had affected him more than he wished to admit. "It is only practical," he said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. They continued the training a while longer, until the sun began to dip low toward the horizon, painting the training yard in warm shades of gold. As they finally set aside the practice swords, Draven studied Elena for a long moment, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, the words clearly difficult for him to voice. "For what I said before the court, that night the moon rose. It was cruel, and it was said without any understanding of who you truly are." Elena studied him carefully, surprised by the unexpected honesty. "Why say it now?" "Because I have spent the past 5 days watching you face attempts on your life with more courage than most trained soldiers I have commanded," Draven said. "And because I am beginning to understand that the moon did not make a mistake, no matter how much I wish to believe otherwise." Something warm bloomed in Elena's chest at his words, though she kept her expression carefully composed, unwilling to fully trust the shift so soon after everything that had happened between them. An apology does not undo what was said in front of the entire court. "No," Draven agreed. "It does not. But it is a beginning, if you are willing to allow it." Elena considered him for a long moment, weighing his words against the memory of his cruelty in the Great Hall, against the warmth of his hand on her arm only moments earlier, against the strange, undeniable pull she had felt toward him since the very first night the moon had chosen her. "I am willing," she said finally, "to see where this beginning leads." Something in Draven's expression eased at her words, a tension she had not fully realized he carried, finally loosening. They walked back toward the palace together in comfortable silence, the earlier hostility between them replaced by something far more fragile and far more precious, though neither of them spoke of it directly. That evening, over a quiet dinner shared for the first time since the night of the blood moon, Draven found himself watching Elena with a curiosity he had not allowed himself before, asking about her childhood, about her grandmother's stories, about the years she had spent working in the palace kitchens without anyone ever truly seeing her. "My grandmother used to say, 'The old magic never forgets anyone,'" Elena said, turning her wine glass slowly between her fingers. "Even those the world overlooks. She said the moon remembers the truth, even when people choose not to see it." "She sounds like she was a wise woman," Draven said. "She was," Elena said softly, a note of grief coloring her voice. "She passed when I was young. My mother as well, not long after. I have been mostly alone since then, working to survive within these walls, without anyone ever truly noticing me, until 5 nights ago." Draven was quiet for a moment, something thoughtful crossing his features. "I find that difficult to understand," he said finally. "How anyone could look at you and not notice you at all." Elena glanced up at him, surprised by the simple sincerity in his voice, and for a moment, something warm and fragile passed between them, unspoken but undeniable. Their quiet dinner was interrupted, however, by a sharp knock at the door. Elder Corwin entered without waiting for permission, his expression grave enough that both Draven and Elena rose immediately from the table. "My king," Elder Corwin said, slightly breathless, "we have received urgent news. A scouting patrol along the eastern border has intercepted a courier carrying sealed letters between Lord Halden's estate and the royal court of Vestmore. The letters confirm what we suspected. Lord Halden has been negotiating an alliance, promising support in overthrowing your rule in exchange for Vestmore's backing, should Lady Seraphine ultimately fail to secure the throne through the bond." Draven's expression darkened immediately, all traces of the evening's earlier warmth replaced by cold, focused fury. "Bring me these letters. They are being brought to your study as we speak, my king, but there is more." The courier revealed under questioning that Lord Halden intends to act soon, before the alliance can be discovered or disrupted. He believes that with Vestmore's support, he can force your abdication and see his daughter placed on the throne instead, regardless of what the Blood Moon has chosen. Elena felt a cold chill settle over her at these words, understanding fully now the scope of the danger surrounding her, danger far greater than two desperate attackers hired in secret. This was treason on a scale that threatened the entire kingdom, not just her own life. Draven turned to her, his expression fierce and protective in a way she had not seen from him before. "You will remain here, under heavy guard, while I deal with this matter directly." "I want to help," Elena said immediately. "This is not a request," Draven said firmly, though his voice carried more concern than command. "Lord Halden's forces, combined with Vestmore's support, represent a serious threat. I cannot protect this kingdom and protect you if you insist on placing yourself in further danger." Elena wanted to argue, but she understood the wisdom in his caution, understood that whatever fragile trust had begun to grow between them over the past hours could not survive if she acted recklessly now, endangering not just herself, but everything Draven was trying to protect. "Be careful," she said instead, and something in her voice made Draven pause, turning back toward her with an expression she could not fully read. "I intend to be," he said quietly. "I have far more reason to survive this now than I did 5 nights ago." With that, he left with Elder Corwin, moving swiftly toward his study, to review the intercepted letters and plan his response to Lord Halden's treachery. Elena remained behind, her heart heavy with worry, understanding that whatever peace had begun to grow between herself and the king was now threatened by forces far larger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined facing. In his study, Draven spread the intercepted letters across his desk, reading through Lord Halden's careful, treasonous words with growing fury. The letters confirmed not only the alliance with Vestmore, but revealed that Lord Halden had been planning this betrayal for months, long before the Blood Moon had ever chosen Elena, using his daughter's planned marriage to Draven as merely one path among several, towards seizing greater power for his family. "He was never loyal," Draven said quietly, more to himself than to Elder Corwin, who stood nearby. "No, my king," Elder Corwin agreed. "It seems Lord Halden has been playing a longer game than any of us realized. The attacks on Elena were likely never solely about preventing the bond. They may have simply been the first move in a much larger plan to destabilize your rule and create an opening for Vestmore's involvement." Draven's hands curled into fists atop the desk, his mind racing through the implications. If Lord Halden intended to act soon, then time was rapidly running out to prepare a proper defense, both for his kingdom and for Elena, who remained the primary target around which Lord Halden's entire treasonous plot seemed to revolve. "Summon my war council," Draven said finally, his voice hard with resolve. "We move against Lord Halden before he has the chance to move against us." As the palace prepared quietly for the confrontation ahead, word of Lord Halden's treachery had not yet reached the wider court, though whispers had already begun to circulate about strange movements near the eastern estates, about increased patrols along the border, about a tension in the palace air that suggested something significant was about to unfold. Lady Seraphine, unaware that her father's careful plans had finally been discovered, continued her own quiet campaign within the court, spreading subtle doubts about Elena's worthiness among the noble families still loyal to the old bloodlines, unaware that the ground beneath her family's entire scheme was about to shift dramatically beneath her feet. That night, as Draven and his war council worked late into the darkness planning their response to Lord Halden's betrayal, Elena stood once more at her window, watching the distant torches of increased patrols moving along the palace's outer walls. She thought of Draven's words before he left, the quiet admission that he had far more reason to survive now than he had 5 nights earlier, and despite the danger gathering just beyond the palace walls, something warm and hopeful bloomed in her chest, fragile, but undeniably real. Whatever storm was coming, she understood now that she would not face it alone. The War Council chamber was thick with tension by the time Draven laid the intercepted letters flat across the long table, each of his commanders leaning forward to study the damning evidence of Lord Halden's betrayal. Elder Corwin stood at Draven's right, while General Ferris, the kingdom's most seasoned military commander, studied the seal of Vestmore, pressed into the wax with a grim expression. "This seal is authentic," Ferris confirmed after a long moment. "There is no mistaking Vestmore's royal mark. If Lord Halden has indeed secured their backing, we could be facing a force far larger than his own household guard, should this alliance move beyond quiet negotiation into open conflict." "How much time do we have?" Draven asked, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Difficult to say with certainty," Ferris admitted, "but if the courier was already carrying finalized terms, it suggests Lord Halden believes the arrangement is close to complete. He may act within days rather than weeks, particularly if he fears discovery." Draven's jaw tightened as he studied the map spread across the table, his mind working through strategies and contingencies with the focused intensity of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of threat, even if he had never imagined it would come from within his own court. "We move against Lord Halden's estate at dawn," Draven decided finally, quietly, before he has the chance to rally additional support or flee toward Vestmore's border. "I want him captured alive, along with any evidence that further implicates those who assisted him." "And Lady Seraphine?" Elder Corwin asked carefully. Draven's expression darkened slightly. "We do not yet know the full extent of her involvement. She will be questioned, but treated with the caution her position demands, until we have clear proof of her own guilt or innocence in her father's treachery." The council continued late into the night, finalizing details of the operation, coordinating guard movements, and preparing for the possibility that Lord Halden might not surrender easily. By the time Draven finally left the chamber, the first hints of dawn were already beginning to color the eastern sky, and exhaustion weighed heavily on his shoulders, though sleep remained far from his mind. He found himself walking once more toward the guest wing, drawn by an instinct that had become impossible to ignore over the past several days. He found Elena awake despite the late hour, sitting curled in a chair near her fireplace, clearly having waited up for news. "It is decided then," she said quietly, reading the answer in his tired expression before he had spoken a single word. "We move against Lord Halden at dawn," Draven confirmed, sitting heavily in the chair across from her. "I wanted you to hear it from me directly, rather than through palace rumors." Elena studied him carefully, noting the exhaustion etched into his features, the weight of responsibility he carried for an entire kingdom now teetering on the edge of internal conflict. "You look like you have not slept in days." "I have not," Draven admitted, managing a tired half-smile. "There has been little time for rest. Between preparing for treason within my own court and learning to properly wield a practice sword against someone far more talented than she gives herself credit for." Despite the tension of the moment, Elena felt a small smile tug at her own lips. "I had a good teacher." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly between them, the weight of the coming dawn pressing quietly against both their thoughts. Finally, Elena spoke again, her voice softer now. "Are you afraid?" Draven considered the question carefully before answering, something he would not have done honestly only days earlier. "Yes," he admitted, "not for myself, but for what might happen if this goes wrong, for my kingdom, and for you." "I am not afraid," Elena said, though her voice trembled slightly, betraying the words even as she spoke them. "You do not have to pretend with me," Draven said gently, reaching across the small distance between their chairs to take her hand, an action that would have seemed impossible only a week earlier. "I have watched you face danger with more courage than most seasoned soldiers, but that does not mean you are not allowed to feel afraid." Elena's fingers curled around his, the warmth of his hand steadying her more than she expected. "Then yes," she admitted quietly, "I am afraid. Not just for myself, but for you as well." Something shifted in Draven's expression at her words, warm and unguarded, in a way she had never seen from him before. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply sitting together in the quiet firelight, the fragile bond between them growing stronger with every passing second. "When this is over," Draven said finally, "I intend to properly court you, as you deserve, rather than simply relying on the moon's judgment to bind us together. You deserve more than an apology, and a bond neither of us chose. You deserve someone who chooses you freely, with full understanding of who you truly are." Elena's breath caught slightly at his words, warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire beside them. "I would like that," she said softly. Dawn arrived far too quickly. Draven rose before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, dressed in armor rather than his usual formal attire, his expression once more composed and focused, the king preparing to defend his kingdom rather than the man who had sat beside her fireplace only hours earlier. "Stay within the palace walls," he said, pausing at her door. "Callan will remain here with additional guards to ensure your safety." "Come back safely," Elena said, and he nodded once, something warm flickering behind his composed expression, before he turned and left to join his assembled forces. The ride toward Lord Haldan's estate was swift and silent, Draven at the head of a carefully selected force of his most trusted soldiers, moving quickly through the early morning mist to avoid alerting the estate's guards before they arrived. General Ferris rode close beside him, his expression grim and focused. "The estate's main gate will be lightly guarded at this hour," Ferris said quietly. "If we move quickly, we can secure the grounds before Lord Haldan has any chance to organize a proper defense or attempt to flee." They reached the estate just as the sun fully cleared the horizon, and Draven gave the signal for his forces to move. What followed was swift and largely without serious conflict. Lord Haldan's household guards, caught entirely by surprise, offering only token resistance before being overwhelmed by Draven's superior numbers and preparation. Lord Haldan himself was found in his private study, still dressed in his nightclothes, clearly having believed he had more time before his treachery would be discovered. His expression, upon seeing Draven enter with armed guards flanking him, shifted rapidly from shock, munching chills to a desperate, calculating attempt at composure. "My king," Lord Haldan began, "I do not understand the meaning of this intrusion." "Do not insult me with denials," Draven cut in sharply, placing the intercepted letters on the desk before him. "Your own seal, your own words, promising Vestmore support in exchange for their backing against my rule. There is no use pretending otherwise." Lord Haldan's composure finally cracked, his face paling as he realized the full extent of what had been discovered. "Whatever you believe you have found, my king, surely we can discuss this reasonably, as men who both wish only the best for this kingdom." "You conspired with a foreign power to overthrow your own king," Draven said coldly. "You arranged attempts on the life of the woman the Blood Moon itself chose as my true mate. There is nothing reasonable to discuss. You will be taken to the palace to stand before the full council and answer for your treason." Lord Haldan's shoulders slumped, understanding finally that there was no path left to talk his way free of the consequences he had brought upon himself. He was bound and led from his estate under heavy guard, along with several of his closest advisors who had assisted in the treasonous plot, while Draven's soldiers began the careful work of searching the estate for any further evidence of the conspiracy. Lady Seraphine was found in her own chambers, having clearly not yet learned of her father's capture. Her shock upon seeing Draven and armed guards entering her room was, to Draven's careful observation, entirely genuine. "What is happening?" she demanded, though her voice carried more fear than her usual composed confidence. "Where is my father?" "Your father has been arrested for treason," Draven said flatly, watching her reaction closely, "for conspiring with Vestmore against my rule, and for arranging attempts on Elena's life." Seraphine's face drained of all color, her hands trembling slightly as the full weight of the accusation settled over her. "I knew nothing of this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I swear to you, my king, I knew nothing of an alliance with Vestmore, nor of any attempts against her life." Draven studied her carefully, weighing her reaction against everything he had learned over the past several days. Whatever cruelty and ambition Seraphine had displayed within the court, her shock now appeared entirely unfeigned, suggesting her father had kept his most dangerous plans hidden even from his own daughter. "You will be questioned thoroughly," Draven said finally. "But you will not be treated as a prisoner unless clear evidence proves your direct involvement. For now, you will remain under guard within the palace, while this matter is fully investigated." Seraphine nodded numbly, clearly still reeling from the sudden collapse of everything her father had spent years carefully building toward. As she was led from her chambers, Draven found himself feeling something unexpected. Not satisfaction at her downfall, but a strange, weary understanding of how easily ambition and fear could drive even reasonable people toward terrible choices. By the time Draven and his forces returned to the palace late that afternoon, word of Lord Haldan's arrest had already begun spreading rapidly through the court, sending ripples of shock and uncertainty through the noble families who had long aligned themselves with his powerful household. Elena was waiting anxiously near the main gate when the returning forces finally came into view, her relief at seeing Draven safe and unharmed, evident in the way her entire body seemed to relax at the sight of him. "It is done," Draven said, dismounting and approaching her directly, ignoring the curious stares of the surrounding guards and courtiers. "Lord Haldan has been captured, along with several of his co-conspirators. Lady Seraphine has been placed under guard while her involvement is investigated further, though I believe she genuinely knew nothing of her father's full plans." Relief washed visibly over Elena's features, though something else lingered beneath it, a lingering wariness born from days of danger that could not simply vanish with a single victory. "Is it truly over then?" "The immediate threat, yes," Draven said carefully, "but there is still much work ahead, both in dealing with Lord Haldan's treason properly and in ensuring the kingdom understands the truth of what has happened, rather than the rumors likely already spreading through the court." That evening, as the palace settled into a cautious, uncertain calm following the day's dramatic events, Draven called for a formal council meeting to address the full court regarding Lord Haldan's treason. Elena, though not required to attend, chose to stand quietly near the back of the hall, watching as Draven addressed the assembled nobles with a firm, commanding presence that left no room for doubt or challenge. "Lord Haldan has been found guilty of conspiring with a foreign power against this kingdom's rightful rule," Draven announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "He has been stripped of his title and lands, and will face appropriate judgment for his treason. Let this serve as a clear reminder to all within this court that loyalty to this kingdom, and respect for the ancient magic that chooses its rightful bonds, will always be protected and honored." The hall remained silent for a long moment before Elder Corwin stepped forward, his weathered voice carrying its own quiet authority. "The Blood Moon does not choose lightly, nor does it choose incorrectly. Those who sought to deny its judgment through treachery and violence have been shown, clearly and decisively, the cost of such defiance." Murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles, though this time, Elena noticed, the tone carried something different than the cruel mockery of that first terrible night. Uncertainty, perhaps even the beginning of genuine respect, replaced the earlier scorn that had greeted her presence in this same hall only days before. As the council meeting concluded, and the nobles began filing out, several pausing to offer careful, uncertain bows toward Elena as they passed, Draven made his way toward her, his expression softening from the commanding authority he had displayed only moments earlier. "You did not have to attend," he said quietly. "I wanted to see it through," Elena replied. "After everything that has happened, I did not want to hide away while you faced the court alone." Draven studied her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded settling behind his pale eyes. "You continue to surprise me," he said softly. "Every time I believe I understand the depth of your strength, you show me there is more." Elena felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, the fragile bond between them growing steadier with every passing hour, tested and strengthened rather than broken by the dangers they had faced together. Whatever challenges still remained ahead, she understood now, standing beside him in the quiet aftermath of the day's dramatic events, that they would face them together, no longer as a reluctant king and an unwanted servant, but as two people slowly, carefully, choosing each other, despite everything that had tried to keep them apart. Elder Corwin arrived at Draven's study 3 days later carrying an ancient, leather-bound book, so old its pages had turned the color of weak tea, cradling it carefully as though it might crumble at the slightest mishandling. "I believe I have found something significant, my king," Elder Corwin said, setting the book carefully on the desk. "Buried within the deepest archives, a record from nearly 4 centuries ago concerning the true nature and purpose of the Blood Moon." Draven looked up from the reports he had been reviewing regarding Lord Haldan's ongoing questioning, his interest immediately captured. "Show me." Elder Corwin opened the ancient book to a page marked with a faded ribbon, the handwriting within cramped and formal, clearly written by a scholar of considerable education, even centuries earlier. The blood moon has always been described as choosing the true mate of the ruling alpha, but this text suggests the selection carries a far deeper purpose than simple romantic bonding. Draven leaned forward, studying the faded script, as Elder Corwin continued explaining. According to this record, our kingdom's founding magic was tied to a bloodline capable of channeling the moon's power directly, a bloodline that grew increasingly diluted over generations, as royal families married for political convenience rather than true compatibility with the old magic. The blood moon, when it appears, seeks to restore that original strength by binding the reigning alpha to someone whose own bloodline carries the necessary connection to the ancient power, regardless of their apparent social standing. Draven's brow furrowed as the implications settled over him. You are suggesting that Elena's selection was not random, that her bloodline carries some connection to this ancient magic. It is more than a suggestion, my king, Elder Corwin said gravely. The text describes specific signs the moon looks for, markings that would only manifest in someone carrying this particular ancestral connection. The very markings that appeared on Elena's skin the night the moon rose match this ancient description precisely. This revelation prompted an immediate, careful investigation into Elena's family history, something neither she nor anyone else in the palace had ever had reason to pursue before. Elder Corwin, along with several trusted palace scholars, began combing through old records, birth registries, and family histories dating back generations, searching for any connection between Elena's lineage and the ancient bloodline described in the text. Elena herself was brought into the investigation once the initial findings were shared with her, sitting in Elder Corwin's private study surrounded by stacks of old documents while the elderly advisor carefully explained what they had discovered so far. Your grandmother, Elder Corwin said, showing her a faded family registry, was born in a small village near the western border, a region that historical records suggest was once home to several families descended from the original bloodline that first channeled the blood moon's power, generations before your kingdom's current royal line was even established. Elena stared at the old document, her grandmother's name written in faded ink alongside a lineage that stretched back further than she had ever imagined possible. My grandmother never spoke of anything like this. She only told me stories, the kind meant to comfort children before sleep. Perhaps she did not know herself, Elder Corwin suggested gently. Or perhaps she chose not to burden you with knowledge that could have made you a target, long before the moon ever confirmed your connection publicly. Either way, this explains why the blood moon chose you specifically, beyond simple chance or fate. Your bloodline carries the very magic the kingdom's founders once relied upon, magic that has grown dangerously thin within the current royal line, after generations of marriages arranged purely for political gain, rather than true compatibility. This discovery carried weight far beyond simple curiosity about Elena's family history. It meant that her bond with Draven was not merely a romantic pairing chosen by ancient magic, but potentially the key to restoring something the kingdom itself had been slowly losing for generations, a deeper, more powerful connection to the very magic that had first allowed their people to thrive. When Draven learned the full scope of what Elder Corwin's research had uncovered, he found himself reflecting with growing discomfort on his earlier cruelty toward Elena, understanding now with painful clarity just how wrong he had been to dismiss her so completely before the court that first terrible night. I called her nothing, he said quietly to Elder Corwin, staring out his study window toward the guest wing, where Elena had spent so many uncertain nights since her arrival. I called her kitchen scraps, in front of my entire court, without ever understanding that she may hold the very key to restoring what this kingdom has slowly been losing for generations. You did not know, Elder Corwin said gently. None of us did, until now. That does not undo the harm my words caused, Draven said, his voice heavy with regret. She deserved so much better than what I gave her that night, regardless of what we have since learned about her lineage. Meanwhile, the investigation into Lord Haldan's treason had continued in parallel with Elder Corwin's historical research, and additional evidence had begun surfacing that painted an even more troubling picture of the conspiracy's true scope. Documents recovered from Lord Haldan's estate revealed that his alliance with Vestmore extended beyond simple political support, involving a shared belief among certain factions in both kingdoms that the old bloodline magic represented, in their eyes, an outdated superstition that should be permanently eliminated in favor of purely political and military power. They intended to eliminate the bloodline entirely, General Ferris explained during a tense council meeting, laying out the recovered documents before Draven and his advisors. Not simply to prevent Elena from becoming queen, but to ensure that no future blood moon could ever again choose someone connected to the old magic, effectively severing the kingdom's ancient roots forever, in favor of a purely political monarchy, aligned with Vestmore's own ambitions. This revelation transformed the entire situation from a personal conspiracy against Elena into something far more significant. A deliberate attempt to erase an ancient and vital part of the kingdom's foundation and history. Draven understood now, with growing clarity, that protecting Elena meant protecting something far larger than a single bond or a single life. It meant protecting the very magic and history that had sustained his kingdom since its founding. Magic that Lord Halden and his Vestmore allies had been quietly working to destroy for their own political gain. Lord Halden himself, when confronted with this evidence during his formal questioning, offered little further explanation, his earlier desperate attempts at negotiation replaced by a cold, resigned silence that suggested he understood fully the severity of what he now faced. "You would have destroyed something ancient and sacred," Draven said during one final confrontation in the dungeon, his voice carrying quiet fury rather than his earlier open anger. "Not simply for power, but to erase an entire part of what makes this kingdom what it is." "The old magic is a relic," Lord Halden said flatly, showing no remorse despite his current circumstances. "Vestmore understood, as I came to understand, that true power lies in strategic alliances and military strength, not in ancient legends about moons choosing mates, based on bloodlines no one can even properly explain." "And yet," Draven said quietly, "that ancient legend proved strong enough to expose your entire conspiracy before it could succeed. Perhaps that alone should tell you something about the power you so easily dismissed." Lord Halden said nothing further, and Draven left the dungeon with a heavy sense of finality, understanding that the man's formal judgment, likely permanent exile or worse given the severity of his treason, would soon be decided by the full council, in accordance with the kingdom's laws. That evening, Draven found Elena in the palace library, surrounded by more of the ancient texts Elder Corwin had gathered, her expression thoughtful as she carefully studied passages describing the history and responsibilities tied to the bloodline she now knew she carried. "This is a great deal to absorb," Draven said, settling into the chair across from her. "It is strange," Elena admitted, closing the book gently. 3 weeks ago, I was simply a kitchen maid, invisible to everyone within these walls. Now I am told I carry a bloodline connected to the very foundation of this kingdom's ancient magic. It does not entirely feel real, even now." "I understand that feeling more than you might expect," Draven said quietly. "I have spent my entire life believing I understood exactly what my role as king required, exactly what kind of bond and bloodline would properly serve this kingdom's future. Learning that everything I believed was based on incomplete understanding, that the very magic I dismissed that first night was pointing towards something far more significant than I ever imagined, has been humbling in ways I am still working to fully accept." Elena studied him carefully, noting the genuine humility in his voice, so different from the cold, dismissive king who had mocked her before the entire court weeks earlier. "You have changed a great deal since that first night," she observed. "I have had a great deal of reason to change," Draven said simply. "Watching you face danger with more courage than I believed possible, learning the truth about your bloodline, and everything it means for this kingdom's future, and simply spending time with you, coming to understand who you truly are, beyond the assumptions I made that first terrible night." Elena felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, the fragile trust between them continuing to deepen with each passing day, strengthened rather than weakened by everything they had faced together over the past several weeks. "Elder Corwin believes," Draven continued carefully, "that fully accepting the bond, properly and publicly, would help restore the ancient magic's strength within the kingdom, magic that has grown dangerously thin over generations of politically arranged marriages within the royal line. But I do not wish to ask this of you simply for the kingdom's benefit. I wish to ask it because I have come to care for you deeply, in ways I did not expect and do not fully understand, beyond anything the bond itself demands of either of us. Elena's breath caught slightly at the sincerity in his voice, at the vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show so openly. And if I were simply a kitchen maid with no connection to any ancient bloodline? Then I would still be sitting here, asking the same question, Draven said without hesitation, because it is you I have come to care for, not simply what your bloodline might mean for this kingdom's future. A slow, warm smile spread across Elena's face, the last remaining traces of doubt and uncertainty finally beginning to ease within her chest. Then perhaps, she said softly, we should discuss what fully accepting this bond might actually mean, for both of us. As their conversation continued long into the evening, the palace around them slowly settled into its nightly quiet, the earlier chaos of treason and conspiracy giving way, at least for this one evening, to something far gentler and more hopeful. Two people who had begun as strangers bound by ancient magic, neither fully understood, now choosing each other freely, with growing trust and genuine affection guiding them forward into whatever challenges still lay ahead. Word soon spread through the palace, and eventually through the wider kingdom, of the discoveries regarding Elena's ancient bloodline and the true significance of the Blood Moon's selection. What had once been dismissed by many nobles as an unfortunate scandal involving an unsuitable servant girl was slowly, carefully, being reshaped into a story of ancient magic, finally restoring what generations of political convenience had allowed to fade, a story that many within the kingdom, weary from years of increasingly distant and politically calculated rule, found themselves surprisingly eager to embrace. Lady Seraphine, still under careful guard while the full investigation into her father's treason concluded, received word of these developments with a complicated mixture of lingering resentment and grudging, reluctant acceptance. Whatever ambitions she had once held for herself, it was becoming increasingly clear, even to her, that the path forward for the kingdom now led toward Elena, not toward the marriage alliance her father had so desperately tried to force through treachery and violence. As preparations slowly began for what many within the palace now anticipated would be a formal, public acceptance of the bond between Draven and Elena, the kingdom itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether the ancient magic that had first appeared as a shocking disruption to the established order would ultimately prove to be the beginning of a stronger, more genuine future for the crown and for the people it served. The Great Hall looked entirely different than it had on the night of Elena's humiliation, weeks earlier. Fresh flowers lined the stone walls, their fragrance mingling with the smoke of newly lit torches, and every noble family within the kingdom had been summoned to witness what Draven had promised would be a formal address of great importance. Elena stood in a small antechamber just off the main hall, her hands trembling slightly, as Wren carefully adjusted the deep blue gown she had been given for the occasion, far finer than anything Elena had ever worn in her life. "You look every bit as a queen should look," Wren said warmly, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "I do not feel like a queen," Elena admitted, smoothing the fabric nervously. "I still feel, somewhere beneath all of this, like the same kitchen maid who used to fold linens in this very palace." "Perhaps that is exactly why you will make a good one," Wren said gently. "A queen who remembers what it means to be overlooked, to be treated as though she does not matter, will never forget to see the people others choose to ignore." A soft knock interrupted them, and Elder Corwin entered, his weathered face carrying an expression of quiet pride. "The king is ready for you, my lady. The full court awaits." Elena took a steadying breath, smoothing her hands once more over the fine fabric of her gown, and followed Elder Corwin toward the tall doors leading into the great hall, the same doors through which she had been dragged, humiliated and afraid, weeks earlier. The doors opened, and the assembled court turned as one to watch her enter. Elena walked forward slowly, her chin lifted with a quiet confidence that had grown steadily within her over the past several weeks, no longer the frightened servant girl who had once knelt before a cruel king's judgment. Draven stood waiting near the throne, dressed in formal black and silver, his expression soft and warm, in a way the court had rarely, if ever, witnessed from their usually composed king. As Elena approached, he stepped down from the raised dais to meet her partway, extending his hand toward her. "My lords, my ladies," Draven said, turning to address the full hall once Elena's hand rested in his own. "Weeks ago, In this very hall, I spoke words I deeply regret. I looked at this woman, whose courage and strength I did not yet understand, and I called her unworthy of carrying my heir. I was wrong. In every possible way a king can be wrong. A hushed silence fell over the assembled court, many exchanging surprised glances at such a public, unguarded admission from their usually reserved king. The blood moon does not choose based on titles or bloodlines determined by political convenience, Draven continued, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. It chooses based on truth, and the truth, which has since been confirmed through careful research into ancient records, is that Elena carries a bloodline connected to the very founding magic of this kingdom, a connection our royal line lost generations ago through marriages arranged purely for political gain rather than genuine compatibility with the old ways. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, though this time carrying curiosity and growing respect rather than the cruel mockery of weeks earlier. Draven turned to face Elena directly, his expression softening further as he continued. But beyond bloodlines and ancient magic, he said, his voice quieter now, though still carrying through the silent hall, I have come to know Elena as someone of remarkable courage, kindness, and strength. She faced attempts on her life with more bravery than many trained soldiers I have commanded. She showed me the truth of my own cruelty, and helped me understand what kind of king, and what kind of man, I truly wish to become. He knelt then, before the entire court, still holding Elena's hand in his own, an act of humility that shocked every noble present, accustomed as they were to a king who rarely, if ever, bent before anyone. Elena, Draven said, looking up at her with open sincerity, I do not ask you to accept this bond simply because ancient magic has decreed it, nor because this kingdom needs the strength your bloodline may restore. I ask you to accept it, because I have come, freely and completely, to care for you deeply. I ask you to stand beside me, not as a queen chosen by fate alone, but as someone I choose, fully and without reservation, every single day going forward. Tears gathered in Elena's eyes, though she blinked them back, her heart swelling with an emotion she had not fully allowed herself to feel until this very moment, standing before the same court that had once mocked her so cruelly, now watching in stunned silence as their king knelt before her. I accept, Elena said, her voice clear and steady despite the emotion coloring it. Not because the moon chose us, though I am grateful it did. I accept because these past weeks have shown me who you truly are beneath the crown, and because I too have come to care for you, freely and completely. A collective breath seemed to release through the hall, and Draven rose slowly, still holding her hand, his expression full of a joy the court had rarely witnessed from their composed king. As he leaned forward to press a gentle, respectful kiss to her forehead, sealing their acceptance before the full assembly, the tall windows lining the eastern wall began to glow with a familiar, soft crimson light. Gasps rippled through the hall as every eye turned toward the windows, where the moon, full and silver only moments before, had once again begun to shift toward its rare, ancient crimson glow, confirming before the entire court that the bond between them had been fully and truly accepted, not through obligation, but through genuine choice freely made by both king and mate. The golden markings that had once appeared on Elena's skin the night of her humiliation began to glow once more, this time joined by similar markings appearing along Draven's own hands and arms, visible proof of a bond now completed and strengthened by mutual acceptance, rather than reluctant obligation. The old magic returns, Elder Corwin said softly, wonder coloring his weathered voice as he watched the crimson light fill the hall. Not simply chosen, but truly accepted. This kingdom has not witnessed such a completion of the bond in over 4 centuries. As the crimson light gradually settled and the markings on both Draven and Elena's skin faded to soft, barely visible traces, the assembled court, one by one, began to kneel, a gesture of respect and acceptance that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier, when many among them had laughed cruelly at Elena's humiliation in this very hall. Lady Seraphine, standing near the back of the hall where she had been permitted to witness the proceedings under careful guard, watched the scene unfold with an expression that had finally settled into something like genuine acceptance. Whatever ambitions she had once harbored, however cruel her earlier actions had been, she understood now, watching the crimson moon confirm what could no longer be denied, that the path she had once envisioned for herself had never truly been hers to claim. In the weeks that followed, Lord Haldan was formally stripped of all titles and lands, sentenced to permanent exile from the kingdom, his attempted alliance with Vestmore thoroughly exposed and denounced before the full council. Lady Seraphine, found to have genuinely known nothing of her father's most dangerous plans, was permitted to remain within the kingdom, though stripped of her noble title, and required to live a quieter, more humble life, far removed from the court politics that had once consumed her. Elena, meanwhile, began the careful, sometimes overwhelming process of learning what it truly meant to serve as queen, guided patiently by both Draven and Elder Corwin, who continued researching the ancient bloodline magic that Elena's presence had begun slowly restoring throughout the kingdom. Reports soon began arriving from distant villages, describing subtle but unmistakable signs of the old magic returning, crops growing more abundant, ancient wards along the kingdom's borders strengthening once more after generations of slow decline. On a quiet evening, several months after the formal acceptance ceremony, Elena stood once more on the same palace balcony where she had first watched the blood moon rise weeks earlier, though now Draven stood beside her, his hand resting comfortably in hers, the crown resting easily on his head, in a way that no longer felt separate from who she had become. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Elena asked softly, watching the ordinary silver moon hanging peacefully in the clear evening sky. "Every day," Draven admitted, turning to look at her with the warm, open expression that had become so familiar over the past months. "I think about how close I came to losing everything that truly matters, simply because I could not see past my own pride and assumptions. I think about how grateful I am that the moon chose more wisely than I did that night." Elena smiled softly, leaning into him, as his arm wrapped gently around her shoulders. "I think about it too," she said. "But mostly, I think about how far we have come since then, from a king who mocked me before his entire court, to a partnership built on genuine respect and choice. The kingdom is stronger for it," Draven said quietly, "and so am I." Below them, the palace grounds stretched peacefully into the evening darkness, guards patrolling calmly along walls that no longer needed to fear treachery from within, gardens blooming more vibrantly than they had in generations, the quiet hum of ancient magic slowly, steadily restoring itself throughout the kingdom they now ruled together. Elena thought of her grandmother's old stories, told by candlelight to a young girl who had never imagined her life would lead anywhere beyond the palace kitchens. She thought of the moon's ancient wisdom, choosing truth over convenience, courage over cruelty, genuine connection over careful political calculation. The blood moon had chosen her, weeks ago, in a moment of humiliation and fear that had seemed at the time like nothing more than cruel irony. But standing now on this quiet balcony, beside a king who had learned to see her clearly, who had chosen her freely and completely, despite everything that had once stood between them, Elena understood fully what her grandmother's old stories had always tried to teach her. The old magic never forgot anyone, even those the world overlooked. And sometimes, the truth the moon revealed was far greater, and far more beautiful, than anyone standing beneath its ancient light could have ever imagined possible. Together, hand in hand, Elena and Draven turned back toward the palace, ready to face whatever future still lay ahead, no longer a reluctant king and an unwanted servant, but true partners, chosen by ancient magic and strengthened by genuine, freely given love.